Maté calls this our toxic culture. He says, we live a toxic culture. Another way of saying it, chronic illness, mental or physical, is to a large extent a function or feature of the way things are, and not a glitch, but rather a consequence of how we live, not a mysterious aberration. The way we live is making us stressed and sick. It isn't a surprise or a mistake. It's a consequence of the way things are. My belief in the necessity of a breakdown is for the sole purpose of interrupting this toxic and chronic pattern of living that is making us unhappy and sick, and finding out how to continue to live in a way that doesn't cause us to malfunction. To redefine normality, not simply as just the way things are done, whether we like it or not, but to define normality as the ways of being that most promote our health and well-being and honour and satisfy our natural way of functioning. Our current idea of normal isn't working. I'm going to read another passage from The Myth of Normal that explains this in a bit more detail. When explaining the purpose of the book, Maté writes, I will make the case that much of what passes for normal in our society is neither healthy nor natural, and that to meet modern society's criteria for normality, in many ways is to conform to requirements that are profoundly abnormal in regard to our nature-given needs, which is to say, unhealthy and harmful on the physiological, mental, and even spiritual levels. In other words, our society is not set up in a way that promotes health, well-being, and peace, and we see the consequences of that everywhere and call it normal, rather than something abnormal that hinders our ability to function in a healthy way that needs to be fixed. I found this in my own recovery, particularly as someone who for a long time was both a perfectionist, addicted to being productive, but also a chronic procrastinator. My neglect of my nature-given needs for rest, recreation, good food, kindness, patience, love, all eroded away at my soul and my body and left me unable to know who I was. I didn't have the time or resources, and when I did, I was afraid of what I'd find. So I procrastinated and numbed out with substances and things, food, fantasy, TV, books, anything attention-grabbing and loud enough to block out what my body was trying to tell me. That I was in trouble, that I was struggling and scared, afraid of the uneasy awareness that my life was out of my control. And the reasons were too much to face. I was afraid to find out why. Most people understand trauma to be the result of a singular event, or multiple events that have lifelong effect. However, Maté describes trauma as not just one singular event that occurs and upsets the course of your life and well-being, but rather trauma exists on a spectrum. He writes, trauma pervades our culture. In fact, someone without the marks of trauma would be an outlier in our society. We are closest to the truth when we ask, where do we each fit on the broad and surprisingly inclusive trauma spectrum? It gets many people's backs up when they hear the word trauma. A lot of people who haven't been through something like war or a car accident often think they don't qualify to consider themselves as someone who has been through or harbours trauma. To be quote-unquote traumatized comes with layers of stigma for each individual. But as Maté describes it, trauma is a lot more nuanced than that. Maté says, trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside you. Think of a car accident where someone sustains a concussion. The accident is what happened, the injury is what lasts. Likewise, trauma is a psychic injury lodged in our nervous system, mind and body, lasting long past the originating incident or incidents, triggerable at any moment. This means we are all susceptible to traumatic psychic injury without even having to have put on combat boots or been physically injured, because trauma happens on the inside. To continue, Maté asks, what is trauma? As I use the word trauma is an inner injury, a lasting rupture or split from within the self due to difficult or hurtful events. By this definition, trauma is primarily what happens within someone as a result of the difficult or hurtful events that befall them. It is not the events themselves. Bessel van der Kolk, another leading trauma expert and psychiatrist, describes trauma as Trauma is when we are not seen and known. So a better way to understand trauma as it applies to ourselves is with more flexible categories and on a spectrum. Maté goes on to describe big T trauma and small t trauma. Big T trauma being the major traumatic events we think of like war, natural disaster, serious injury, child abuse and domestic violence. Small t trauma is considered a lot more personal, like loss, betrayal and heartbreak. What matters is that whether we realise it or not, we have likely all experienced some form of trauma, big T or small t, and lie somewhere on that trauma spectrum. What's important about this and important about understanding that trauma is a much bigger category than it's seen as in popular culture is that the effects of trauma across the board affect us in similar ways. Maté writes that big T and small t trauma both represent a fracturing of the self and of one's relationship to the world. That fracturing is the essence of trauma. As psychotherapist Peter Levin writes, trauma is about a loss of connection to ourselves, our families, and the world around us. This loss is hard to recognize because it happens slowly over time. In a society where we chronically disconnect from ourselves and our needs, where we neglect ourselves and numb ourselves to the pain and consequences that causes, the cavern that is created within us, that loss of connection to ourselves grows wider apart. We suffer the effects of trauma. The issue is that we hardly have the time or the silence to even realize it, let alone fix it, unless of course in many cases you're forced to stop and deal with it because you've been interrupted by a breakdown or some other physical interruption. So why does it have to go that far before we realize something's wrong? Maté writes, if trauma entails a disconnection from the self, then it makes sense to say that we are being collectively flooded with influences that both exploit and reinforce trauma. Work pressures, multitasking, social media, news updates, multiplicities of entertainment sources, these all induce us to become lost in thoughts, frantic activities, gadgets, and meaningless conversations. We are caught up in pursuits of all kinds that draw us in, not because they are necessary or inspiring or uplifting, or because they enrich or add meaning to our lives, but simply because they obliterate the present. Awareness of the moment has become something to fear. I want to say that again. Awareness of the moment has become something to fear. The meaning of the word trauma in its Greek origin is wound. Whether we realize it or not, it is our woundedness or how we cope with it that dictates much of our behavior, shapes our social habits, and informs our ways of thinking about the world. It can even determine whether or not we are capable of rational thought at all in matters of the greatest importance to our lives. And I would say that that is what your breakdown is causing you to finally connect to. Awareness. Is the life you are currently living, the way you are living it, working for you? Sometimes your body, like-minded, answers that question for you. Sometimes in the form of a breakdown or an illness. Whatever it takes to get you to stop and pay attention, to become aware. In the rest of Maté's book, The Myth of Normal, he explains in depth the connection between trauma and various illnesses and immune disorders, the patterns and examples he's seen in his own practice of how unaddressed and unreleased trauma. What I found in my own experience and research reading books like Maté's or Bessel van der Kolk, Pete Walker, and many other writers, psychotherapists and doctors and forums, is the consistency of the same effects and symptoms across the board, whether it be big T or small t trauma. The same 5 symptoms kept popping up: anxiety, depression, addiction, self-hatred, self-harm. What I call the big 5. Everything from experiencing an accident, divorce, bullying, abuse to overworking, busy work schedule, lack of sleep, poor diet, people-pleasing, self-abnegation and neglect, being unable to ask for help, lack of boundaries, the list goes on. No matter what, if unchecked and treated, they all seem to lead to the big 5. Anxiety, depression, addiction, self-hatred, and self-harm. So the reason why I'm an advocate for a good old-fashioned breakdown is because you need it. You need time to figure out what it is that is causing you to feel the way you are currently feeling. What you're experiencing are symptoms of something else. If you dislike yourself, feel unhappy, are depressed, anxious, wrestling with addiction and disordered eating, you're not abnormal. You are experiencing the simple universal law of cause and effect, the consequences of living in a toxic culture. A toxic culture that gaslights you by calling itself normal when it's not. Your difficulties and stresses should exist as evidence to you that regardless of what you think you should or could be feeling or experiencing, the reality is that the way you are currently experiencing your life isn't working positively for you. You have and are experiencing the wide spectrum of trauma in its varying forms, so change is needed. You need to ask yourself, what is my trauma?